Look, I don't need to tell you about fan fiction. You already know what fan fiction is, but here's the thing. What you're seeing right now is a lot of real person fiction. And there's a big distinction. Fan fiction is when you take characters that people already know and like and love and appreciate, and you go, I want to take these characters in a different direction. Well, RPF is about real people, and it's happening a lot right now, particularly with the stars of Heated Rivalry. And so Kat Tenbarge wrote about this for Teen Vogue, and she's here to talk about the ethics, about whether it's ethical to write a whole fictional story about real people that exist. I got a lot out of this conversation, things that I'd not thought about before, and I really just hope that you get into it. Let's go. Kat, good to see you. How you doing, pal?
I'm good. Thanks so much for having me back.
Yes, of course. Listen, let's talk about this. When and how did real person fiction start to emerge?
Yeah, so I spoke with a Harvard professor, Anna Wilson, who teaches classes about fan fiction. And she told me that the origins of real person fan fiction actually predate the internet by quite a bit.
Hmm.
She traced it back to the earliest days of old Hollywood when film studios created these magazines for fans that often had these like semi-fictional narratives about the actors and actresses that they were promoting at that time.
Wow, the idea of like this being like 100 years old practice actually like did not even occur to me, but makes a lot of sense. Is there, in your view, like a substantive difference between the kind of person who consumes fan fiction on the internet and the kind of person who consumes real person fiction? Is there a substantive difference between those audiences, do you think?
It's a great question. I think there is a ton of crossover. And once you are in the fan fiction space, you are inevitably going to encounter real person fan fiction in some way, shape, or form. There's a lot of people who read and write and enjoy both.
Hmm.
There's also this sort of demographic that I've seen for years of people in the fan fiction community who are adamantly opposed to RPF on these moral, ethical grounds.
The idea of being opposed to it. I want to come back to that in just a moment. But you talked about the roots of RPF being, dating back 100 years. But this stuff is having a big moment now. When you sort of like survey the scene and look around right now, what do you think is driving that demand? Like, why are people turning towards RPF?
Yeah. So, according to Google Trends, we can see that there is a historic interest right now in RPF. And that peak aligns with sort of the commotion around Heated Rivalry.
Hey, go off. Okay, continue.
Yes. So, with the success of Heated Rivalry, which is deeply enmeshed in fan fiction culture, the show started as a fan fiction and it relies on a lot of fan fiction tropes within its narrative. And so people are obsessed with the show. They're writing fan fiction about the show. And there's also this sort of meta obsession with the cast. So
Hmm.
we're seeing a lot of RPF feature the actors in Heated Rivalry and a lot of discussion that borders on conspiracy about the relationships and sexualities of these actors.
Okay, we got to talk about names then. We got to talk about like the stuff that we're seeing. So you're talking about Connor Story, Hudson Williams, of course, the stars of Heated
Yes.
Rivalry, and their personal lives has generated all kinds of interest. There's been a lot of tabloid photos, particularly of Connor Story. Tell me about the kind of stuff that you're seeing in terms of the RPF that people are sort of imposing on the lives of the stars of Heated Rivalry.
Yeah, so I think that the pairing of Hudson Williams and Connor Story is definitely probably the most popular.
Yeah.
When I survey the scene on Archive of Our Own, I'm seeing a lot of this pairing. But there's also this conversation happening simultaneously around like what these actors' sexualities are and
Hmm.
whether Francois Arnaud, who plays another character in the show, is in a real life relationship with Connor
There's
Story.
a lot of speculation about that sort of being a real life relationship as well. Yes. Yeah. Continue. Sorry.
Exactly. Yes. So there's a lot of discourse around that. And then there's also a lot of sort of transformative fanfic and fan art based around not only these people, but their characters and the messy sort of interplay between them.
So to make this distinction super clear, yes, there is lots of fan fiction about what's happening with Ilya and Shane. There's so much of it, the internet is already drowning in it. But on top of that, what you're talking about is like people are sort of imagining and writing their own stories of what's happening to Connor and Hudson
Yep.
and everybody else who's involved in the show as they sort of like navigate this gigantic sort of real life fairy tale, I guess, of a relatively small show becoming a gigantic show. What is it you think about this show that sort of like created this like really ripe environment for RPF, for people going like, I'm not going to write about the character, I'm going to write about the real life actors who play these characters?
Yeah, I mean, I think that at the heart of RPF is this really compelling premise, which is this idea, and some people believe in it wholeheartedly, and some people are just playing with it in a fantasy kind of sense.
Yeah.
But it's this compelling narrative that these actors who have been thrust onto the world stage and been extremely exposed are still hiding this very vulnerable part of themselves.
Yeah.
Like the narrative of a secret relationship and a secret sexuality is the actual narrative of heated rivalry. So it it makes a lot of sense why that would carry into sort of, again, like the real life version of these characters and these personas.
Yeah.
And a lot of times with RPF, what you see people engaging with is not necessarily the real person, because at the end of the day, they don't know them. What a lot of times you see happening is the fandom creates this sort of persona of the real actor or the real singer or whoever it is.
Mm-hmm.
And that sort of like half real, half fictional persona that the fandom embraces becomes the subject of this transformative work.
Kat, what you're sometimes seeing is like the comparisons between RPF to deepfake porn, like in the sense that like writers are sort of like positioning real people in highly sexualized contexts that maybe they didn't necessarily give consent to. Does that comparison hold up for you? Does that feel like it's sort of in the pocket of comparisons here?
It's a really interesting comparison. I've done a lot of work around both things, fan fiction and deepfake abuse. And I don't think that the comparison holds as much water as people may think. For one, when you look at deepfakes, they are taking the actual real photos and videos of overwhelmingly female celebrities, and they are using AI tools to manipulate these images into something that looks convincingly realistic and sexually explicit. With fan fiction, you're doing something very different. A lot of RPF isn't even sexually explicit. The earliest RPF and a lot of RPF today is pretty tame and doesn't necessarily involve sex at all. But in addition to that, you're not taking the real person and manipulating or modifying their image. It's not like the actual likeness, like I mentioned before. It's more this sort of persona, this like very fictional, transformative persona that people are playing with. And I've also noticed that within these communities, there's a real difference in intent, because in deepfake spaces, which are very male dominated and overwhelmingly target women and girls, you do pick up on this ideology of sort of, we should possess their likeness. We should be able to get away with manipulating and abusing these likenesses for our own pleasure. And that sort of reinforcing of the patriarchal status quo. Whereas with fan fiction, it's almost the opposite. It is very sort of like radically reorienting, like who has power in this situation. And it doesn't typically come from a place of malicious intent. Within fan fiction communities, there are rules and norms around like, we shouldn't be bothering the celebrities. We shouldn't be putting this in their faces. And that boundary, I think, sort of becomes the line of ethical consideration of, is it ethical to make RPF or is it violating?
In your piece about RPF for Teen Vogue, you start off by telling the story of these two guys, Dan and Phil, who are two very popular YouTubers in the UK. And in this clip that we're going to hear, they're talking about how they've become subjects of shipping in real life fiction stories.
Now we had hundreds of thousands of people on the internet feeling like we are in their lives. It's kind of nice.
Yeah.
You did like a skeptical, I thought that was a sweet
No, it was
thing.
it's kind of a nice thing.
Yeah, nice.
Nice.
Slight dystopian edge, but here we are.
Yeah, seems pretty innocent.
But then the inevitability of human nature. No person, character, or piece of furniture can exist before the inevitable shipping begins.
No. It's not will Spider-Man the Hulk. It's when.
Shipping, of course, is a short form for relationshipping. It's like when you sort of say these two people, we're going to ship them together. They should be having a relationship together. What makes Dan and Phil such a useful case for understanding where RPF is at right now, Kat?
Yeah, I mean, so in this video released a few months ago, Dan and Phil, who are these British YouTubers and one of the most popular RPF pairings of all time, at least in the internet age.
Yeah.
So for over a decade, fans of Dan and Phil have written fan fiction, have drawn fan art, and many have actually believed that they were in a secret gay relationship. And as it turns out, they were right. They were in a secret gay relationship basically this whole time. And so that to me was a really stunning sort of sequence of events. And this video in particular is very interesting to me because they talk about ways in which the community was sort of handling this respectfully and in an almost like sweet way versus things that the fandom community did, people within it, that crossed the line. And so Dan and Phil didn't really have a big problem with like sexy fan fiction written about them. They didn't have a big problem with people speculating or theorizing or even fantasizing. What crossed the line for them is when it became something that they could no longer avoid. They talked about how people would spam their comment sections with the ship name fan. They talked about how at live shows, people in the audience would yell out like fan is real, and then it would become this whole thing. And they talked about how people would film them in public and even reach out to their family members trying to get information about them. So that is where we see this line being crossed, this ethical boundary between transformative fan works and actually harassment.
Those are very distinct things. I also like, listen, Kat, you know that I'm a Swiftie. You're familiar with this particular part. But Taylor Swift has been subject to many RPS for some time. One of the more sort of consistent and lasting ones has of course, been the Gaylor theory, the theory that, Taylor Swift is secretly gay. She's been in a relationship with Karlie Kloss for a long time, or they had a relationship, but they're no longer in a relationship. And she's sort of like she's kind of quietly and then a bit more forcefully sort of expressed frustration with that sort of kind of consistently being a part of the public thread. And that felt like to me like one of those things where inside the Swiftie community, there has been no particular regulation of it. Like no one really knows what to do with it because that is literally just information that we don't have from the person themselves. And then it comes with all kinds of projections, all kinds of meanings. There's been people like long form essays written about it, but also a lot of RPF written about that.
Yes, Gaylor is a really interesting one because the majority of RPF, for the most part, is a lot of times women writing about men. You will see within like RPF categories on Archive of Our Own, it's overwhelmingly dominated by this idea of shipping together two men in real life. And that tracks with fan fiction trends in general, like yaoi or M/M fanfic is the overwhelmingly most popular type of fan fiction. And it is predominantly written and consumed by women. So you have a very interesting gender dynamic here. And with Gaylor, it's kind of flipped on its head because it's a lot of, again, women speculating about Taylor Swift's sexuality and whether she may be queer. And so Taylor herself has not really come out and addressed this, but a couple of years ago, her publicist in a statement really condemned Gaylor and described it specifically as a Taylor-shaped hole in people's ethics, which I find really interesting. And even at the time, I was like, that's super interesting because Taylor Swift, they were framing it as like people only do this to Taylor Swift, which we know is not true. But we also see here that she wants to draw this boundary. I think what they were really pushing back against here was the idea of Gaylor being legitimized. They were really pushing back against like mainstream media coverage and buy into this theory.
I will say like that statement was following like a really long form personal essay in the New York Times that wasn't so much about the Gaylor theory so much as it was about what maintaining that does for a person. It was actually, I felt like it was like a really deeply personal essay, but I also understand that was, read by a large audience because it was published in the New York Times. Look, in your recent piece for Teen Vogue, the question you're asking is like, how do you write and read RPF ethically? Where do you land on that question? Is there an ethical path? Is there an ethical path, for sort of consuming RPF, you think?
I think there is. And I think that the guidelines that Archive of Our Own has put in place, which that Harvard professor reiterated to me in our conversation, like this is a good guideline. And what it is that inherently there's nothing wrong with RPF. What you have to do is make sure that you are not intentionally exposing the subject of the material to it. So with Archive of Our Own, it's like you can't send this story to the person it's about as a gift. You can't email it to them. You can't post it on other parts of the internet and tag them in it or like go to their house and try to get them to read it. But as long as you put it in this space, which is a pretty insular community, and as long as you've properly tagged it and people know what it is and they're not being surprised by the content, then it's totally fine. And I am inclined to agree with this because I think we've seen this model work well in the past. What's different now is that a lot of fandom activity is happening on platforms like X. And so X is not an insular space like Archive of Our Own or Tumblr. It is an algorithm-driven social media platform. So like at a party this weekend, someone brought up how they had seen explicit RPF art from Heated Rivalry on their X For You page. And I was like, oh, this is interesting because now, because of algorithm-driven social media platforms, these are no longer insular spaces. And so there is more of a likelihood that the person who it's about is going to see it by the fault of the tech company more so than the fan who created it.
Yeah, that opens up an entire different path. And you're like, should they be subject to this at all? I think like there's a deep sort of discomfort there. I appreciate you guiding us through this entire conversation. Kat, you're the best. Thank you so much for coming on, friend.
Thanks for having me.
Yes, of course. Kat Tenbarge is a tech culture journalist and publisher of the newsletter Spitfire News. She was in New York. That is it for the show today. My name is Elamin Abdelmahmoud. This show is called Commotion. By the way, happy Lunar New Year to you. It's the year of the horse. We're going to see you tomorrow. The show will be back. Have a great day.